Hello, July, it's been a while since the sun came out and made you smile. 'Cause maybe it went out of style to shine. Hello, July, yeah, how you been? It's so good to feel you on my skin. So maybe I should let you in this time. Been caught up in a hurricane, been down to hell and back again for July. I can see a brighter day, I can feel a change in the weather, babe. Oh, July. Hello, July, I hope you'll stay. Oh, yeah. No one but you takes my breath away. It's only cloudy sky.
Good morning, Humber Valley. My name is Sally Jo Martin. We are so glad you're here. Let me begin by saying, whomever you are, wherever you're from, whatever you've done or left undone, whomever you love, you are welcome here. For thousands of years, Indigenous people have walked on this land. Their relationship with the land is at the center of their lives and spirituality. We who are settlers have much to learn from our Indigenous siblings. We are gathered on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, and Métis. This land is home to many diverse Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Please join me in the prayer for worship. Lead a life to which you are called. We cannot do this alone. We dare not try this alone. So we gather as God's people. Lead a life worthy of your calling, a life filled with service and meekness. We come to build up Christ's body in humility and gentleness, with patience and love. Lead a life which reflects your calling, that life of peace grounded in the Spirit. We rejoice in our oneness in Christ. We share the grace offered to everyone we meet. Live a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. We gather as God's family to celebrate who God is and all God is doing. The scripture reading this morning is from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. As a prisoner of the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God, one Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all.
Hey, good morning, Humber Valley. My name is Trevor Brisbin. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Look, things are going to look a little bit different this morning. Rather than me teaching, I thought I wanted to introduce you to one of my good friends, someone who has been my minister in the past, and someone who I think has something to say and can really speak into our life as a community of faith at Humber Valley United Church. So on the screen, all the way from Glendale, California, we've got Aaron Van Voorhis on the phone. Aaron, how are you, buddy?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Aaron is, well, you're a husband to Emily, you're a dad to two beautiful girls. You're the minister, you're the pastor at Central Avenue Church in Glendale, California. You're also the author of this great little book, A Survival Guide for Heretics, which is a fantastic name. And as soon as I heard he was working on a book called that, I knew we were going to be fast friends. But Aaron, hey, when we were living in California, you were our minister. We went to Central Avenue and have become friends, and you've had a big impact on my life. So thank you so much for making space on this July morning for Humber Valley and for myself to be here. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, no, thank you. Good to be here.
So Central Avenue is a church primarily of, I would say, when we were there anyway, 20 and 30 somethings,
Right.
A lot of young families. But that's not what you found when you started in 2009. Tell us a little bit, Aaron, tell us anything that I missed in the intro. Tell us about yourself that you want to know, and tell us about church at Central Ave.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in the Chicagoland area, both my wife and I. And then we went to Nashville, Tennessee for undergraduate. And my wife attended Vanderbilt and ended up getting a master's in nursing. And then I attended a small Christian private school in Nashville where I got a bachelor's in biblical studies. And then we moved out here to Los Angeles in 2006 for me to go to Fuller Seminary. And we stayed because I got this job at then it was called First Southern Baptist Church at Glendale. I got the job there right out of seminary in 2009 because I wasn't Southern Baptist and because that church really wanted to move away from being part of the Southern Baptist tradition and become an independent, non-denominational church and more progressive. And because I had a background in church plants and non-denominational church plants, they hired me to help them go through that transition process. And we changed the name from First Southern Baptist Church at Glendale to Central Avenue Church and cut our ties with the SBC a year after I started there. But again, it wasn't a hostile takeover. A lot of people thought, oh, this young pastor guy came in there and just took it over and kicked out all the Southern Baptists and changed it into this progressive post-evangelical community. No, it really was a mandate that I was hired to perform. And some of the founding members who were still there, I mean, these are folks who founded the church in the late 1950s. They were part of the hiring of me. And again, it was when I signed on, a very small, dying church. Average age was probably in the 60s. It was the founders and the founders' children, and their children were not children. These were people in their 50s, and so these were, these were all seasoned adults. But again, I was hired with the mandate to come in and really change things and transform the church into a more progressive and open-minded community, because they saw the writing on the wall. They knew they were dying, and they knew they had to change significantly in order to thrive again, ideally. What they didn't know, and what I didn't know early on, was just how much changing would actually take place. And by that, I mean, I came in thinking, well, my goal is to make this more of just inclusive and more, I guess the thinking was intellectually honest. That was kind of the buzzword we were using. And by intellectually honest, we meant more open to science and embracing unknowing and a different view of scripture that wasn't hyper literal and just more liberal, a little more liberal than where the church was. And what happened was we became more and more, I think, progressive, but in a good way. We became more organized around issues of social justice and more open minded about critiques and doubts and those kinds of things. But in any event, the story of Central was basically, the hope was that the founders and the founders' children were hoping that they would hire this nice young pastor from Fuller. We would get rid of the hymnals and the organ and the handbells, and we would become a church of 200, like within like a year. They thought, we changed the name, we changed the worship style, we changed the pastor, and we'll go from 20 to 200 in a year or two. Well, we went from 20 to 40 something in a year or two. You know, the story of Central is really a story of a church that completely changed, but it certainly wasn't overnight. It changed in its vision, in its values, and its demographics. And it took probably about 5 to 7 years for that really to happen. And so so that was basically 2016 when I felt really became who we are now. And over the last 5 years, we've just been kind of existing as that. And it's been great.
Yeah, I mean, it's been great. I can't imagine how much pain and tears and long nights and meetings would have been included in those, in the last 12 years.
Sure, I've got some stories. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, so in your book, you've got this really great chapter, which for the record, I just want to show this. I've got stuff underlined here, okay? Like I've read this thing.
You've read it. You're the one who read it. All right, good.
Chapter 6, your title is "The Church Will Not," and "not" is in parentheses. The
Right.
church will not survive.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, "not" is in parentheses because I mean both that the church will survive and the church will not survive. And of course, I'm talking about the church, right? The big church. And basically what it means is that there's certain, in my thinking, in my experience, there are certain kinds of church that are dying, right? And I think that conservative and fundamentalist type churches will not completely die off, but I think they're going to continue to lose numbers. And I think even progressive churches are going to continue to diminish and lose numbers. I think the church in America is going to become, and in Canada, and we'll say North America, the church throughout North America, I think is going to continue to diminish both the conservative and the progressive or the liberal ends of it. And I think the culture here is going to continue to become more like Western Europe. And perhaps Canada is already closer to a Western European post-Christian culture than the United States. I don't know. I think that's probably accurate. You're nodding yes. Okay. So, but specifically in my context in America, in the United States, fundamentalism still has a pretty strong hold compared to Western Europe and Canada. And I think that that's going to remain, it's somewhat in place, but I believe that the conservative churches are going to continue to wane. And we're going to become more and more like Canada and Western Europe here. Eventually, it's taking longer. So by that, I mean parts that fundamentalism and fundamentalist churches are still going to exist for the same reasons that, and I say this in that chapter, for the same reason that drug addiction will always be with us. There's always going to be people that crave an escape, that crave an unhealthy relationship to substances and ideas that allow them to kind of escape the truth of their lives and to cover over their brokenness and their unknowing, and unhealthy religion for the same reasons that drug addiction exists. Unhealthy religion will always exist to some degree, but again, it's going to continue, I think, to diminish as more and more people become part of that demographic called the nuns and duns, right? And so that's what I mean by the church will in parentheses not survive. We're going to see a continued evolution of the church in North America in the direction that I described. That's what I mean by that.
Okay. So what kind of churches are you seeing that are thriving more than others? Have you seen what do they look like? What is the common denominators?
Yeah, I think the common denominators of progressive churches that are doing really well are churches that embrace a very inclusive message, churches that talk a lot about social justice issues and that are anti-racist, that are LGBTQ affirming, but these churches that are also embracing of the difficult questions around faith and belief and are engaging in those kind of deeper conversations. I think those churches, in my opinion, are not just more healthy churches to go to, but are also churches that I think tend to attract people. But again, I want to be very clear that this is not a recipe for growing a big church. I think the biggest misunderstanding a lot of people have is, oh, if we just become a progressive and open-minded and a church maybe with a better liturgy or a better worship style, we get like the worship team, the worship band up there with, the drums and the guitars, that we're going to become, like a bigger church or something. That is proving not to be the case. And to be clear, I think just because a church becomes a more progressive or liberal church, it actually doesn't really result in it becoming a larger church. So I want to be clear about that as well. For me, the goal in becoming a successful church it's not about attendance, building, and cash, the so-called ABCs of ministry. It's not about growing numerically necessarily. It's really about becoming more faithful in our commitment to the values of love and justice and honesty. These kinds of values. That's the measure of success in my mind. But don't get me wrong, numbers do matter. You want to see people show up and engage, and we have some of that. But it's not to be compared to any a mega church model of doing church, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Hey, so I think this is a fair sort of assessment, and I can say it to you as a good friend and a cherished colleague. But your sort of approach to pastoral care, your sort of philosophy of pastoral care, would be different than probably, the 99 other ministers in the room. Because you sort of tend to, you do come at pastoral care and all your sort of pastoral vocational instincts through sort of this idea of radical theology, which I'm going to ask you to kind of unpack a little bit and explain. But in terms of, as Central Avenue was shifting and was moving from sort of Southern Baptist, which roots in slavery and racism and just horrible things, and moving to non-denominational or like just more this progressive, generous space of thinking and being and worshiping Christ. What did pastoral care look like for you, for someone who's coming out of the radical Christianity tradition? So maybe can you quickly frame that, because we haven't used that sort of bracket yet, in terms of an actual label at Humber Valley. And what did that mean for you? The message that you had for parishioners, members who were kind of wondering, where do I fit into this transition? How does this work for me? Does that make sense? That's a long.
Yeah, it does. Sure. So you want me to define radical theology a little bit first?
Yeah, define radical theology, and then how do you use it to sort of, walk along as a minister with the congregation?
Radical theology unfortunately suffers from a name problem a little bit. People assume you mean extreme theology or awesome theology. Radical theology does not mean that. It is a school of thought that essentially was coined in the late 1960s, coming out of the academy, coming out of philosophy of religion departments in the United States, where you had philosophy of religion professors, both philosophy professors and religion professors, wrestling with the increased secularization of the world, wrestling with the role of religion in the modern world, in this kind of post-enlightenment age of reason. How does God make sense? And radical theology is also called sometimes death of God theology, which is a pretty scary name sometimes because it freaks people out. Death of God theology, right? But it is a deeply Christian theology in the sense that at the center of it is the cross and this idea of a crucified God. And radical theology explores what this idea of the death of God might mean in the modern context. And it is, of course, rooted in philosophical traditions coming out of Western Europe, like continental philosophy, specifically the work of Nietzsche. It's coming out of the work of Marx and Freud, and this critique of religion and this recognition that in some ways, in some capacities, religion has died. God has died in our time through the Enlightenment, through the Age of Reason, through the critique of science and philosophy. What then does God, what then does Christianity mean in this kind of post-theology or post-theistic, post-metaphysical context? And so radical theology is an attempt to express Christianity and express faith, if you will, in that context. And so all that is to say that I have harnessed or utilized radical theology as a working pastor in my tradition to help people make peace with doubt and unknowing. And for me, the core of it comes down to this. It's this idea that through the embrace of life as it is, in all of its difficulties and all of its perplexities, in all of our doubts and unknowing, we embrace that. We embrace the absurdity of life. We embrace the unknowability of what happens after death and the incomprehensibility of our own possible future non-existence and suffering. We embrace suffering as a way of making peace with it, as a way of transcending it, as a way of, as in essence, it is for me what it means to embrace the cross and this idea of God crucified, a God who cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the reality of the human experience, that we find ourselves in the world kind of isolated and alone and without God. And so we cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the core of the Christian experience. We acknowledge the godlessness of the world. And in that way, we find another way to be. We find the courage to be. We find resurrection and new life in the radical embrace of life in the world as it is. We find serenity. We find peace. We find new life. We find hope. And radical theology ultimately leads us to a place, I think, where we find a kind of wholeness in giving ourselves over to love and giving ourselves over to matters of justice and equality and embracing each other and embracing the world as we and the world really are, broken and troubled. But again, in that we find hope, we find peace, we find Christ, we find God. For me, that's the message of the cross and the gospel, that God is found in the brokenness. God is found in, incarnated in the flesh, in all of its mortality and all of its finitude. We find God here and now. I'm trying to explain a lot really quickly, but
no, Aaron,
it is this courageous way of embracing the cross, embracing the grave the way that Christ did. But through that is this kind of mystical realization that we find resurrection and new life and joy in the aftermath of that. And that's for me the radical theology understanding of Christianity. And for me, it is the only understanding of Christianity that makes sense. For me, it's deeply pastoral. Now I'll get into how it's pastoral and how I've integrated it into my church community. For me, it's the only way to articulate the Christian faith in a way that makes sense to modern people. By modern people, I mean people who understand science, people who refuse to, treat religion like a drug and use religion to cover over the truth of their lives and the truth of the suffering they see around them. This is the only expression of Christianity that makes sense to those people in my experience. Again, it sounds a little atheistic because it is a little atheistic. It is a way of, in essence, embracing the absence of God in the world and in essence, finding God in the midst of that absence. And that's paradoxical. That's dialectical. It's a kind of mysticism because it says that all of divinity and all of that which is sacred and holy and transcendent and divine is found in love itself, in this life, in this world. It's found in the simple beauty of a flower. It's found in the simple beauty of sharing a meal with friends. It's found in just giving ourselves fully over to each other and to this life the way that Christ showed us. And that way God is here, God is now. Divinity and sacrality is here and now. It is the Lord's Supper. It is bread and wine. It is Christ now. And yeah, that sounds a little atheistic and a little disavowal of heaven on high, because we're saying the kingdom is here, the kingdom is now, heaven is found in each other. And for me, that's beautiful. And for me, that as a pastor, that's been a deeply meaningful thing for my community. But again, it's a bit of a shock to people, sometimes. But for those already going through deconstruction and questioning everything and kind of losing the conservative faith of their upbringing, this becomes a kind of balm. This becomes a kind of catharsis. It does become a kind of healing step in my experience. But it's something you can only you have to go through it yourself to understand it. It's not something that you can just kind of know abstractly without going through it. It is a participation in the death and resurrection of Christ, you could say. Only those who bear the scars of the crucifixion know the resurrection. You have to undergo the death of God to really know what I'm talking about, in a way. So from a pastoral standpoint, I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to, ultimately what it does, this is what I wanted to say about this. What this means also is theology and beliefs are kind of suspended in a community like this. And by that, I mean that we open ourselves up to a plethora of different beliefs. In other words, people at Central, some are more conservative, some are more progressive in their beliefs. You still have folks that still believe in the literality of the resurrection, the historicity of the resurrection of Christ. You have folks that see that as entirely symbolic, entirely mystical, and not literal at all. And what radical theology does from a pastoral perspective is it de-emphasizes right belief for the sake of right action. The question becomes, how do you believe what you believe? How do your beliefs influence how you actually live in the world? Do your beliefs help you be a more loving and just person? Do your beliefs help you become just a better person? And if so, those beliefs are to be affirmed, regardless of kind of what they are. At Central, we don't get hung up on trying to get everybody focused on, a set of doctrinal beliefs. We don't have a statement of beliefs that you have to adhere to be in communion with us. We have a set of values and practices instead. Values like love, values like inclusivity, values and practices like, basically, being honest about who we are and what we believe and what we don't believe, and practicing, the Lord's Supper every week. That's one of the practices that we gather around. So for us, we value values and practices more than right belief, and radical theology has allowed us to kind of step into that. And for me, again, pastorally, telling people how you believe, what you believe matters more than what you believe, helps people kind of relax and helps people not feel like they have to adhere to a set of beliefs anymore, that they can have beliefs, and we all have beliefs. And that's wonderful, and that's to be affirmed. And so pastorally, that's kind of where I take that. It's not about getting everybody to believe like I do, but helping people kind of, go on their own journey, their own spiritual journey, and be at peace with that. And the goal isn't to believe like the person next to you. You can have your own beliefs about God, Jesus, and the Bible. That's wonderful. But let's gather around a set of shared values: love, inclusion, justice, honesty. Let's gather around that. Let's share in the Lord's Supper together as a way of trying to be Christ in the world today. So that's pastorally how this has worked out at Central. I hope that makes sense.
No, that's good. Thank you so much. And we're running out of time. The two things I would just sort of, taking what you said and sort of applying it directly to the Humber Valley context, which obviously you don't know because you haven't been able to be up here yet. But one of the things is why. Why are we, we're going in the midst of this transformation, much like Central Avenue did, in terms of, moving forward and trying to find a way to be the church in a new and different world than when the church was started. And one of the questions is not what are we going to do? The question that kind of I'm most interested in is why are we doing it? And I keep coming back to Genesis 12 and, the Abrahamic covenant, where when God says, Abraham, go, change everything, like radically reimagine how you relate to this world. And the reason of why sounds very radical theology, that you might bless others, that you might love, not that God's going to, make everything okay in your life, not that everything, all the suffering and the pain and everything's going to fall into a neat box, but go on this adventure because it's good and because you're loved and you need to love others. And the second thing, I think what I've heard you say, just relating it directly to the context, is in the midst of some of the scary things, the death of God, of oh my gosh, what does this mean for our future and what's going to happen, is we're also not doing this alone.
Yeah.
Post-Enlightenment thinking is Trinitarian or communal thinking. We are communities of faith because we don't have to experience the horrors and the scariness and the anxieties of life on our own. But we've organized in this radical experiment called the church, filled with the Spirit of Christ, in order that we would do this and pursue this together. And if that's not good news, I mean, it hurts, right? Like, Christians can get on our nerves when we're together. That's why we have courageous conversations and Matthew 18 and all that stuff. But we're in this together, and that's a beautiful, incredible thing. Hey, listen, I'm so glad that I'm in this with you, buddy. Thank you so much that we can be colleagues, we can be friends. Can't wait to get down to California. Love to the family. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Well, thanks for having me, and best of luck to you and your community. I know you're doing a great job, and I look forward to maybe meeting them soon.
Will you join me now in praying the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. This is the part of our week where we invite anyone who would like to participate financially in supporting the ministry and life of Humber Valley United Church to do so by going to hvuc.ca and click on the donate button, or you can write a check and mail it to the church, or even just call the church and we can arrange for a volunteer to pick up the check from your house or your offering from your house. Thank you so much for the way you contribute to the important ongoing ministry and work of Humber Valley. So now as you go into your week, go seeking to heal that which is wounded, love that which is disturbed, bless that which is broken. As you go, seek to be the change that brings greater beauty, wisdom, and hope. Love deeply, serve well, and be gentle on creation. For you are God's child. In the name of the Creator, the Christ, and the spirit of love. Amen.
Hello, July, it's been a while since the sun came out and made you smile. 'Cause maybe it went out of style to shine. Hello, July, yeah, how you been? It's so good to feel you on my skin. So maybe